For the Ukrainians to win this war, not only does the balance of forces continue to need to tip in their advantage, three things have to happen. Number one, they need a lot more equipment. Now, obviously, the West is pushing on that as fast as it finds feasible. Everyone's going to have their own opinion about what weapon system and what time frame. And that's important. More important is that the Ukrainians get equipment that they can actually use quickly without additional training. So we're in the process of training up tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers across NATO countries. The first batch of 5,000 just went back to Ukraine last week. But more important is that the several million Ukrainians under arms actually get arms they can use. That's not long-range artillery. That's not fighter jets. That's not tanks. That's former Soviet stuff. And one of the best things that happened as part of the Izyamin assault is this little cluster right here, this little tip. That's Izmin. That is the place that the Russians were planning on doing a spider web of attacks from, pushing west into Ukraine proper. And they ran. And they left everything. And so in one day, the Ukrainians got more weapons transfers from the Russians than the West has given Ukraine in 6 months. They doubled the number of tanks they have overnight, and they're tanks they know how to use. And they're now starting to use them. There's a lot of deferred maintenance that needed to be done. But they're working on it. For the Ukrainians to win this war, we don't just need another Kharkiv. We need 20 of them. The scale of the territory here is huge. Ukraine is roughly the same size as Texas. And they have to destroy the Russians' capacity to fight. Russia has fought 50-odd wars. Weather has won most of those. It's a waiting game with the Russians. So if the Ukrainians are going to pull this off, they have to destroy the ability of the Russians to fight in the first place. That has never happened without at least 500,000 battlefield deaths. At most, we're at 70 right now. The way you do that is you blow up this piece of infrastructure in the south. This is the Kerch Bridge. Now, it's a little difficult to tell its scale here, but all the dotted lines on this map are the rail networks. And there is not a single rail network, that goes from the Donbass in the east to the southern front at all. It all comes in via one link over the Kerch Bridge into Crimea and then north. If Kerch is destroyed, the Russians lose all rail support. And if they capture Kherson, those green arrows, they're likely to get almost as many tanks as they did at Izmail, because the Russians can't take the tanks with them across the bridges. The bridges are too damaged. They have to get out and walk. If you do that, you leave roughly 2.5 million Russian citizens in Crimea and the vast bulk of the Russian military position in Ukraine without supply. And starvation of Ethiopian scale starts. That is how Ukraine wins. Balance of forces still favor the Russians here strongly, but we're getting surprised over and over and over and over again, which means that we shouldn't count on this being quick, we shouldn't count on this being decisive, and even if it is, that does mean the death of Russia as a state. So whether the Russians win and we're at the gates of Warsaw, or the Russians lose and we're looking disintegration in Moscow, either way, we are in a very different economic world. Oh, yeah, okay. One more thing, well, no, like one of 1,000 things. The first column, if you put Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in kind of the same bucket, collectively are the world's largest supplier of the first column. Number 2 for the second, third for the third. I'm going to be speaking at Langley next week, and they only want to talk about this. We're going to have 4 hours on just this. Holy crap. Yeah, not intimidating at all. I'm going to fly through a few that don't touch you guys directly, and some that do. But most of the energy stuff we're going to treat separately. So first of all, nickel, copper, aluminum. Can you do anything in the EV or the green tech or the electricity space without those? Okay. Lesson number 1, the materials inputs that we need to do what you guys do are going to be in circumscribed supply moving forward. Building out new supplies of this on a global scale is a 25-year project. The world's #1 wheat exporter has invaded the world's #5 wheat exporter and is deliberately destroying any civilian infrastructure it comes across, with a double emphasis on anything agricultural. Ukraine will cease being an oil or a food exporter after the end of this year. We will never rebuild that. Here's my personal nightmare. Not only are these parts of the world important for food supply, they are the world's biggest suppliers of the materials that are necessary that we all use to make fertilizer. Specifically, Belarus and Russia are responsible for 40% of global potash. Hasn't been interrupted yet, but remember, this either ends in Warsaw or it ends in Moscow. You should count on all that going away. The increases that we've seen, the food inflation we've seen, this is before we actually have disruptions into the input flows. Now, we have been very fortunate in calendar year 2022. Mother Nature has given us great growing weather in most of the world. So we're not looking at food shortages this year, unless you happen to be a beneficiary of like the UN food program, which gets most of their grain from Ukraine. But the fertilizer flows have already been interrupted. This is a problem for next year. Neon. You guys all seen Star Wars, right? I mean, not like lightsabers, but Reagan. So in 1983, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they almost got rid of all nuclear weapons. Good summit. But at the last second, Gorbachev said to Ronnie, this is all dependent, of course, on Star Wars going away. Because if you've got a missile shield and none of us have weapons, that's just not fair. And Reagan's like, oh, well, this has been a fun meeting, and he left. Gorbachev went back to Moscow convinced that Star Wars and things like it were the future of great power competition. So he gave the orders to start building out the supply chains that would be necessary to build a constellation of giant space lasers. Neon is used to focus the apertures of the lasers. So the Soviet Union built out a neon supply system. The Soviet Union collapsed a few years later. They never got the satellites up, but the neon system was already there now. Well, neon is produced in a two-part process. Step one, you start with a steel foundry, which has something called an air separation unit, where they pull out the atmosphere and separate it into oxygen, nitrogen, and everything else. And use the first two canisters to blow into the foundry system to get the right temperature gradient that you're after. That third canister is then sent to a more advanced separate facility, where they separate out the argon and the helium and the neon. The first phase facilities are all in steel foundries in southern Russia, which are now shutting down because of sanctions. The second phase happens in two places, One is Odessa, which hasn't had electricity for 4 months, and the other one is in Mariupol, which has since been leveled. That is 80% of global neon gone. Today, we don't use neon for space lasers. We use them for the lasers that etch semiconductors. And we have lost 80% of global supply.